My name is Eliza Whitmore. I am 23 years old, and on the 14th of March, 1839, I stood on an auction block in Richmond, Virginia, not as a victim, as a hunter. While men in fine coats circled me like I was livestock, measuring my teeth and my wrists and my worth in dollars, I was doing something none of them could imagine. I was choosing my buyer. I was selecting the man who would unknowingly invite his own reckoning through the front door of his home. I wasn't trembling with fear. I was trembling with the cold, controlled fury of a woman who had spent her entire life being erased and had finally decided that her silence was over. And before I go any further, I need to ask you something. If you had spent your entire life being treated as invisible, as worthless, as someone else's property, and you finally had the chance to look the man responsible directly in the eyes, would you have the strength to do what I did? Or would fear have won? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from, friend, because the people who find these stories are never here by accident. If this is already moving something inside you, hit that like button, and if you want to follow Eliza's story all the way to Philadelphia, subscribe. This channel is kept alive by people like you. Every comment, every like, every new subscriber helps put food on a real family's table and keeps these forgotten voices from disappearing forever. Now, let me tell you about the morning Thomas Whitmore saw my face in the sunlight, because that was the moment everything he had buried for 30 years came back to the surface. But before I tell you what happened inside those walls, before I tell you about the morning Thomas Whitmore saw my face in the sunlight and forgot how to breathe, I need you to understand something. Everything I did, every calculated move, every quiet night I spent pretending I didn't exist was for one reason. My mother, Catherine, spent 19 years writing letters to a daughter she was forced to sell. She wrote in secret. She wrote knowing I might never read a single word, and she signed every letter the same way. Yours, in blood and in truth. What I carried onto that platform wasn't rage. It was her name. And I intended to give it back to her. Riverside Plantation sat 12 miles outside Richmond, where the James River bent like a tired man's back. I remember the smell of it before I could see it. Red clay baking under a March sun that had no business being that warm, sweet rot rising from the tobacco fields. And something else underneath it all, something older and heavier, like grief soaked into the ground itself. The main house was white and tall, with columns that caught the afternoon light and made the whole thing look like a painting. A lie painted in white. The kind of beauty that only holds together if you never look at what's underneath it. The oak trees lining the road had been there longer than anyone's sins. They had seen everything. They kept every secret. And as the cart carried me down that long dirt path, I looked up at those branches and thought, so have I. My days at Riverside began before the sun. I was assigned to the house, a deliberate choice on my part, one I had engineered through careful behavior at the holding pen, presenting myself as educated, composed, useful indoors. I dusted mantles and polished silver and carried trays of food to people who never once looked at my face while accepting what my hands offered. I pressed Margaret's dresses and laid out Thomas's morning coat and listened. Lord, how I listened. Every conversation that floated down the hallway, every argument half swallowed behind closed doors, every name dropped at the dinner table. I stored it all. I was invisible in the way that only the enslaved are forced to be, present in every room and absent from every mind. But invisibility, I had learned, was not weakness. It was a door left unlocked. The wound I carried had a specific shape. It wasn't the hunger, though I knew hunger well. It wasn't the cold nights in the quarters before I moved indoors, or the way certain men looked at you like you were something they had already decided to take. The wound had a name. Catherine. My mother was sold away from me when I was 4 years old, not by a stranger, not by some faceless trader, but because the man who had fathered me needed the money to settle a debt and felt no particular obligation to the child he had made with an enslaved woman. I grew up knowing her only through those letters, smuggled through a network of hands I never saw. She described her eyes. She described mine. She told me I had her voice, her hands, her stubbornness. She told me, in one letter that arrived when I was 16, that Thomas Whitmore knew exactly who I was and had chosen to do nothing. The moment everything changed was a Tuesday morning, 9 days after my arrival. I was carrying a breakfast tray through the main hallway when the light shifted, a cloud breaking, sun pouring sudden and sharp through the tall east window, and Thomas Whitmore stepped out of his study directly into that light, directly into my path. He looked up. I did not look away. I held his gaze for exactly 3 seconds, and in those 3 seconds I watched the color leave his face like water draining from a basin. His hand found the doorframe. His mouth opened and closed without producing a single sound. Because I had done what my mother described in her letters, I had tilted my head, just slightly, to the left. The way Catherine tilted hers in every portrait he had commissioned of her. The gesture he had loved. The gesture he thought he had buried along with every inconvenient truth about his past. The choice I faced in that hallway was not simple. I could lower my eyes, become invisible again, let him convince himself he had imagined it. That would have been the safer road. But I had not engineered my way onto that plantation, had not memorized every detail of my mother's letters, had not swallowed 19 years of silence to look away at the first crack in his armor. So I held my ground. I steadied the tray in my hands, and I said quietly, in the voice my mother told me I had inherited from her, "Good morning, Mr. Whitmore. Shall I leave your coffee in the study?" Just that. Nothing more. But my voice in that hallway was a stone dropped into still water, and both of us felt the ripple move through the house from floor to ceiling. The consequences came within the hour. Thomas summoned his head overseer, a thick-necked man named Grady, and had me reassigned, not back to the fields, which would have made sense if he simply wanted me gone from his sight, but to his private study, to clean it, alone, every morning. I understood immediately what that meant. He wanted to look at me where no one else could see him looking. He wanted to examine what the years had made of Catherine's face, transplanted onto the daughter he had never acknowledged. He was not ready to speak the truth, but he was no longer able to pretend the truth didn't exist, and that, I realized, as I walked toward that study with my spine straight and my hands steady, was the first crack in the foundation of everything he had built on top of my mother's suffering. The first opposition came from Margaret. She was 26, 2 years older than me, with her father's sharp eyes and her mother's, her legal mother's, practiced coldness. She noticed the reassignment within a day, and she did not like it. She began appearing at the study door while I worked, inventing reasons to enter, watching me with that particular expression wealthy women reserve for things they cannot categorize. She complained to Thomas that I was too slow, too quiet, too present. He overruled her each time, which only sharpened her suspicion. One afternoon she stopped me in the corridor and stood close enough that I could smell her rosewater perfume and said very quietly, "I don't know what you think you're doing, but I am watching you." I looked at her, really looked at her, and felt something unexpected move through my chest. Not fear, not hatred, something closer to grief, because she had our mother's mouth and she would never know it. At night, alone in the small room off the kitchen that had become mine, I lay awake and interrogated my own certainty. I had spent years constructing this plan with the architecture of pure purpose, every brick laid with deliberate fury. But fury, I was discovering, is not a clean fuel. It burns unevenly. In the darkness of Riverside, with the smell of tobacco and river clay coming through the window, I began to feel the weight of what I was doing. Not guilt, not yet, but a growing awareness that I had walked into a house full of people who were also, in their own distorted ways, shaped by the same original sin. Thomas had chosen cowardice over and over. But at night, through the thin walls, I could hear him pacing. A man who hadn't slept properly in 9 days. A man being haunted by the ghost he had purchased with his own hands. The second obstacle arrived in the form of Richard. He was 19, Thomas's son from his legal marriage, and he had inherited his father's name without his father's guilt, which made him, in many ways, more dangerous. Richard had the casual cruelty of someone who had never been required to examine his own comfort. He began testing me in small ways, moving objects after I had cleaned to see if I would be blamed, speaking to me in front of guests in a tone designed to produce humiliation, reporting imagined infractions to Grady. One morning he came into the study while I was working and stood behind me in silence for long enough that my hands went cold on the cloth I was holding. "My father seems fond of you," he said finally. "That's unusual." He let the sentence hang in the air like a threat wearing the costume of an observation. I did not turn around. I kept polishing the silver candlestick until I could see my own face in it. Then the external forces began to move. Word travelled among the enslaved at Riverside, as word always did, through looks and silences and the invisible language built by people who cannot afford to speak openly, that Grady had been asked to watch me specifically. Not for any named infraction, but for the vague and terrible crime of being noticed by the master. In that world, being noticed was its own indictment. 2 women who had been kind to me in my first days began to keep their distance, not from cruelty, but from self-preservation. A man named Solomon, who brought wood to the house each morning and always nodded to me at the door, stopped meeting my eyes. I understood. I had come here carrying a weapon, and weapons have a radius. The people closest to me would feel the blast whether or not they had chosen to stand there. My most vulnerable moment came on a Wednesday evening in late April. Thomas called me into his study after supper, dismissed the other house staff, and closed the door. We stood on opposite sides of his desk in the lamplight, and for a long time, neither of us spoke. He looked older than he had 9 days ago, diminished, like a building with the load-bearing wall quietly removed. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and unsteady, and he said, "You have her eyes." Not a question, a confession. And something inside me, the part I had armoured most carefully, the part built from 19 years of letters and absence and longing, cracked open without my permission. I had prepared for his denial. I had prepared for his anger. I had not prepared for the possibility that Thomas Whitmore would look at me across that desk and simply break. What he showed me that night was a locked box he pulled from the bottom drawer of his desk. Inside it were letters, my mother's letters, the ones she had written to him after he sold me, after he sent her to his cousin's plantation in Georgia and tried to put the whole inconvenient chapter of his life behind him. She had written to him for 11 years, begging him, first, to find me, then simply telling him I was alive, that she had heard word of me through the networks that connected the scattered and the sold. He had kept every single one. He had never responded to a single one. And beneath the letters, folded in a piece of blue cloth that had once been part of a dress, I recognized it from her description, was a small portrait, miniature, painted on ivory. My mother's face, my face, staring up at me from inside the locked box of a man who had loved her and abandoned her and kept her memory like a private wound he had no intention of healing. That discovery rewrote everything I thought I understood about my own story. I had arrived at Riverside believing Thomas Whitmore was a simple villain, a man of pure calculation who had used my mother and discarded her and felt nothing. The letters dismantled that narrative completely. He had felt everything. He had simply chosen, repeatedly, deliberately, to let feeling exist privately while his public life continued undisturbed. That was not innocence. That was a more sophisticated kind of cruelty. The cruelty of a man who understood exactly what he was doing and did it anyway because the cost of doing otherwise was too high for his comfort. But it also meant something else. It meant that every wall he had built inside that house, every careful architecture of denial, had a foundation of guilt. And guilt, I now understood, was not a weakness in my plan. Guilt was the door, and I was already standing inside it. The impossible choice arrived on a May morning when Solomon was caught carrying one of my mother's letters, the ones I had been quietly showing to trusted people, building a quiet testimony of truth inside Riverside's walls. Grady had found it on him. The punishment for something like that, in that place, in that time, was not a fine or a reprimand. It was the kind of violence that left marks that never fully healed. Or worse, a sail to somewhere farther south where the brutality was less bothered with pretense. I had two options. I could step forward and claim the letter as mine, expose myself completely, detonate everything before I was ready, risk losing the ground I had spent months gaining. Or I could stay silent and let an innocent man absorb the consequences of my war. Neither choice was clean, neither choice left me whole. I stood in the yard with the morning light flat and white above me and felt for the first time the true price of the weapon I had chosen to carry. I stepped forward. I told Grady the letter was mine. I told him Solomon had found it on the ground near the woodpile and had been bringing it to me when he was stopped. I said it calmly, with my hands still and my voice even, and I watched Grady's eyes move from Solomon to me and back again, calculating, suspicious, uncertain. Thomas appeared at the edge of the yard before Grady could respond. I will never know if by chance, or because he had been watching, as I suspected he always was now. And with a single quiet word, he dismissed the situation entirely. Solomon walked away without looking at me. I stood in the yard alone and understood, with absolute clarity, what my decision had revealed. I was not only my mother's instrument of justice, I was also, whether I had chosen it or not, responsible for the people caught in the orbit of my purpose. That knowledge changed the weight of everything I carried from that morning forward. The confrontation I had engineered for months arrived not with the dramatic architecture I had imagined, but in the quiet of the Riverside parlour on a Sunday evening in June, with rain moving in slow sheets against the tall windows and all three Whitmores seated together for the first time since my arrival. I walked in carrying a tray, and I set it down, and I did not leave. Thomas looked at me. Richard looked at his father. And Margaret looked at my hands, then at my face, then at her father's face. And I watched the recognition move through her like a current through water, slow and then all at once. I said what I had rehearsed 10,000 times in the dark of my small room. I said it without theatre, without trembling, in the voice my mother gave me. My name is Eliza. Catherine was my mother, and she was your father's daughter too. No, She was the woman your father loved and sold and spent 30 years trying to forget. I am what he could not forget. The rain filled every silence I left behind those words. What followed was not the explosion I had prepared for. Richard stood and left the room without speaking. The exit of a young man whose understanding of his own life had just been structurally compromised and who needed walls around him before he could process it. Margaret sat completely still for a long time, and then she did something I had not calculated, had not prepared for, had not allowed myself to imagine. She wept, not with anger, with a grief so unguarded and so genuine that it reached across every boundary I had constructed and touched something I had been protecting for years. Thomas signed my manumission papers that same night. He did not ask for forgiveness. Perhaps he understood that some debts exist beyond the reach of formal pardon. He signed with a hand that shook slightly and slid the papers across the desk without meeting my eyes. I folded them carefully. I placed them inside the blue cloth that had held my mother's portrait. And I breathed for what felt like the first time in 23 years, without the specific weight of being someone else's secret pressing down on every corner of my chest. I left Riverside on a Thursday morning in July when the heat was already thick before sunrise and the James River caught the early light like hammered copper. I carried almost nothing: the papers, the portrait, 3 letters my mother had written in her clearest hand. I did not look back at the white columns or the oak trees that had witnessed everything. I had spent years believing that justice would feel like victory, clean and complete, like a door closing on a finished chapter. It did not feel like that. It felt like survival, which is quieter and heavier and more honest than triumph. I took the name Whitmore not as a gift from Thomas but as a debt collected, a truth extracted from a system that had tried to make my existence a footnote in someone else's story. I carried it to Philadelphia. I carried it forward. And if my mother could see me walking north on that July morning, papers folded against my heart, I believe she would not have called it victory either. She would have called it hers. And that, after everything, was enough.